Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our Geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region room. Every second Monday, Dr. Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo, and host Maya Matsuoka, lead a discussion on the latest developments, new challenges, and shifts in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions. So if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the conversations on Japanese politics, business insights, and the Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. This is the inaugural meeting of Geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region with Dr. Stephen Nagy and me, your host, Maya Matsuoka. I'm sure that most of you already know Dr. Nagy, if not personally, at least through his articles and interviews for national and international TV channels and media outlets. And just a short introduction. At the moment, he is a senior associate professor in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University. And he is also a research fellow with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and a visiting fellow with the Japan Institute for International Affairs. Previously, he was selected as a distinguished fellow for the Asia-Pacific Foundation, and he was a distinguished fellow there from 2017 to 2020. And he was also an assistant professor at the Department of Japanese Studies from December 2009 to January 2014. Well, Stephen, if you're willing to tell us a little bit more about your credentials, please do it in a few minutes. Just a few more words from me about this room. So, in the past several years, we have seen a shift in the power balance in the Asia-Pacific region. And as new economies emerge, there have been also a shift from talking about the Asia-Pacific to actually defining the region as the Indo-Pacific, which is, well, a new paradigm, I believe. So today's conversation will be why the Indo-Pacific. And, well, I believe that Stephen already has all the reasons lined up, and he's going to let us know. So, Stephen, please go ahead and let's talk about this.
Thank you very much, Maya, and thank you very much to everybody that's joined this inaugural Geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific, and especially looking at it from, I think, Japan's perspective. And I'll bring in many perspectives, but Japan will try to be kind of the starting point for discussions. I'm very happy to see many friends on the calls, Timothy, Tomomi, Dr. Story, Reiko, Aya, Fong, Jacob from Poland, Lynn, and many others. So I'm glad that you could participate. I really encourage that you jump in and flag Maya when you want to share your ideas and comments. Although I want to shape the dialogue, I want you to also contribute and add to the dialogue every week when we're hosting these events. If you have questions, clarifications, or you want to kind of just bring a different angle to the discussions, please do. That's really, really important. Lastly, please call me Stephen. We're all distinguished fellows and fellas in this room, and I really want to have a very flat discussion because I think I can learn from all of you. So when Maya and I were devising this kind of room, she asked me what would be an important geopolitical paradigm to be thinking about, and I put forward this idea of the Indo-Pacific. And for many of you, I think we've really thought about the region and we've thought about geopolitics either through Asia or through the idea of the Asia-Pacific. And whether you're a business person or a policy person, the Indo-Pacific concept or framework is relatively new. And I think that it's something that you're probably unfamiliar with. Why are we focusing on the Indo-Pacific rather than the Asia-Pacific or Asia? And that's a really, really important question. So today, what I'd like to do, just to frame the discussion before I bring you into you guys in to teach me, and ultimately we're going to have a great dialogue, is I want to focus on three different areas in today's discussion. The first is answering this question: why have we transitioned from thinking about the Asia-Pacific to the Indo-Pacific? Second, I want to introduce some of the key drivers. And then I want to introduce some perspectives, because not everybody sees the Indo-Pacific region in the same way. And that's actually really, really important, because it sends a signal about how this region is contested, or that it's not firmly grounded in the way that we conceptualize, for example, the EU, where Jacob is from. So I would like to touch upon that because I think it's really important for us to be thinking about that. And then lastly, I want to touch upon, I think, what's important is leadership. And here, I'm going to probably try and leverage some of the experience of Timothy and others in the room. What does changes in leadership and regional events mean for the Indo-Pacific idea? So we're going to have a new prime minister in Japan. So Prime Minister Suga is on his way out, and we're going to have a new prime minister. We've had the Afghanistan debacle, as some media has called the retreat of the United States from Afghanistan. We're going to have a new government in Canada. The Biden administration is in a bit of a trouble point now. We're going to have a new administration in the Philippines. So we have a lot in terms of leadership transitions within the region. And I think this all will impact how we think about the Indo-Pacific. So, the question is why have we transitioned to the Asia-Pacific, to the Indo-Pacific? And this is a really, really interesting question. And I think that we can look at it from a lot of different ways. But the real driver of this hasn't been the United States. And I think this is a misnomer, that the United States has been the one that's been driving the transition away from the Asia-Pacific to the Indo-Pacific. In fact, it was the Japanese, and the Japanese under former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. And what we saw is former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe introduced this idea of the confluence of two seas, so the connection between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean as being a really critical region for the future of global trade, global development, new institutions, and I think potential instability. And he did this at a speech in India to the Indian Parliament back in 2007, directly addressing this idea that India is going to be an important partner in an Indo-Pacific region, and that Japan and India and others within this region need to be at the forefront of leading this region's development. And you may be asking, why did Abe do this in India? Well, there's many domestic politics behind this, but Prime Minister Abe and many conservatives in Japan have a long-term affection with India, associated with a former judge at the Far Eastern trials in in Japan after World War II. And one of the judges dissented on the eventual verdict against the Japanese. And since that period of time, the conservatives in Japan, when they're looking at issues within the region, have had a relatively inclined disposition towards India. India as well looks to Japan as, in many ways, a model and inspiration for its own development. Japan has enjoys a coexistence of hyper modernity, as we see in Shibuya and Shinjuku and now in and around Tokyo, in the Marunouchi district. But we also have these traditional places like Kyoto. And for India, Japan represents the future, the direction that India would like to go. So there was a lot of synergy in terms of their shared views about region, their shared views about their past, and of course their shared concerns about China within the region. And the transition towards the Indo-Pacific has been very much about thinking about how to create a new center of gravity, economic gravity, institutional gravity, that can constrain, and I don't say contain, I say constrain and shape China's behavior so it's a more productive and cooperative partner within the region. And this has been a very, I think, important aspect of the shift towards the Indo-Pacific. Now, what are the key drivers? The key drivers are many, and I think that I've mentioned some of them, but really the gravity of economic development is within the so-called Indo-Pacific region, and it stretches, depending on your country, it'll stretch from North America through to the Pacific, through the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, all the way to the east coast of Africa in the case of Japan. In the case of the United States and Canada, they extend themselves to the western Indian Ocean. In the case of India, they look at the so-called Indo-Pacific region through the Indian Ocean and possibly through the western aspect of the Pacific Ocean. There's many, many views. But one of the key aspects is this understanding that the economic growth of the world is going to be centered where the biggest, the most populated countries are, China, India, Indonesia, Japan. This is very, very important for thinking about why we want to invest in more of our diplomatic resources within the region. But not only economic dynamism, it's really important for us to be thinking about this region is in terms of the lack of institutions. So you might have heard of this so-called Asian way, where through consensus-based decision-making, the ASEAN countries, that's those 10 Southeast Asian countries, come to consensus on an issue and they try to push forward on policy development that way. Well, when we're thinking about this idea of the region itself, it's very institutional poor, which means that it doesn't have institutions to deal with a lot of the challenges moving forward, whether it's trade, whether it's regulation, whether it's the recent health crisis that we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic. So the lack of institutions means that if you're not at the forefront of building institutions within the region and trying to create the rules of the road within the region, you could be left behind. And the expression we often use is that if you're not at the table in terms of making rules, you could be on the menu. And I think this is something that Japan and other countries have been really conscious of, is that this region needs more rules, it needs more strong institutions, and it needs to focus on how it's going to develop moving forward in terms of a rules-based order that's transparent, environmentally friendly, and mutually beneficial. So the lack of institutions is another key driver in terms of thinking about the Indo-Pacific region. Now, another important area is, of course, what we call the maritime domain. And what we see is the maritime domain in the Indo-Pacific being contested by China and many of the so-called littoral states of the Indo-Pacific. So if you think about the East China Sea, we have territorial challenges between Japan and China. If we think about the South China Sea, we have territorial challenges with many of the Southeast Asian countries. And I think some of our Southeast Asian friends can talk about this, and I encourage you to come on and talk about this as well. In the Indian Ocean, we also have some, not so much contestation over territories, but I think that there's concerns that, in particular, China is moving into a space that India understands as its traditional backyard, and its sphere of influence. So the maritime domain is something really, really important. And you might be thinking, why is it important? Well, simply it's because of the sea lines of communication, those important arteries that transport goods and energy resources in and out of all the important economies of this region. And that's really important for you to be thinking about. South Korea is the 12th most important economy or biggest economy in the region. Japan is number 3. China is number 2. India is, I think, number 5 or 6. All of these economies depend on sea lines of communication. And if there's a disruption in the sea lines of communication, or one country that doesn't practice a rules-based approach to managing these sea lines of communication, we're going to have a challenge. And this is a real concern. Last but not least, I think there's a lot of other issues, is that the region is also an area of instability, both from the transnational security issues such as transnational diseases or climate change, piracy, but also I think transnational challenges in terms of thinking about sovereignty. And this means that this region is a place of instability, a place that if we don't invest resources in, that it could create challenges in terms of its economic development. And if its economic development becomes stunted or it becomes chaotic, of course, this is going to have repercussions everywhere. And you might be thinking, what do you mean? How much trade are different countries doing? Well, think about Japan's biggest trading partner, China. About 26% of its trade 26% of its trade is with China. So if there's a disruption in any of these areas, it's going to create a big challenge. If there's a disruption in the Taiwan Straits, in the East China Sea or the South China Sea, well, this is going to affect the imports and exports of European countries in and out of, the 13th, the second, and the third largest economies on the planet. So what happens in the region really, really matters. Lastly, I mentioned those kind of non-traditional security issues like climate change, piracy, transnational diseases. Well, we've all been impacted by COVID-19 over the past 18 months, and that is such a relevant example in thinking about the region and thinking about how challenging pandemic can be and how it can affect our economies, our lifestyles, our educations. So really, this region requires more investment, it requires more diplomacy, it requires more rules and more institutions. And I think this is the reason why many countries have shifted away from just an Asia-Pacific view to an Indo-Pacific view. Lastly, and I really want to get the insight of our Indian friends in the room as well, the placement of Indo-Pacific is really quite explicit to acknowledge India's and South Asia's rise in the global economy. When the Asia-Pacific term was initially put forward back in the late 80s, early 90s, really India wasn't on the economic map. India wasn't a big player outside the subcontinent or the South Asia. But today, the Indian economy is much bigger. It's much more integrated into regional supply chains, and it's become a much more important country and region in terms of thinking about the global direction of development. And in this sense, India and South Asia has become an important area to recognize as we think about the trajectory of development moving forward. So the key drivers, that's a few key drivers that I want to touch upon. Lastly, I want to talk about, I think, those changes that we should be thinking about within the region. One is leadership. One is these particular events like Afghanistan. So we've watched probably with consternation over the past week or so of what's happening in Japan in terms of leadership. I think most of us knew that Prime Minister Suga was on his way out. The question was when he would be on his way out. And I know many people have asked me privately online as how is this going to affect Japan's Indo-Pacific vision, or how is it going to affect the so-called free and open Indo-Pacific vision that the Japanese are talking about. And frankly, I don't think it's going to affect it much. Prime Minister Suga was a domestically oriented prime minister, and here, Timothy, I'd love to hear your comments afterwards. He was focusing on digitizing the economy, of course, dealing with the corona pandemic, and he had very little experience in managing international affairs. So over the past year, I think the free and open Indo-Pacific vision that Japan has put forward has been on auto drive. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in conjunction with the Ministry of Defense, has really continued to push forward the idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific because it's so important for Japan and how Japan thinks about China and how it thinks about the importance of engaging with China, trying to build a positive relationship, but also doing that from a position of strength. And that means being embedded in the Indo-Pacific economy, creating trade agreements, helping build institutions, helping with development. So leadership has been really important in terms of thinking about how the Indo-Pacific is moving. But when we do kind of a look at other countries within the region, not all countries are interested in the Indo-Pacific within the Indo-Pacific region in the same way. So if we go first to South Korea, the Republic of Korea, the Moon administration has been relatively hesitant to discuss the Indo-Pacific, and they're very hesitant to use the Indo-Pacific terminology because their biggest trading partner, of course, is China, and China sees the Indo-Pacific vision as a code word for containment. something that the United States is compelling countries like Japan and others to adopt to contain China and stop China's rise. I don't think this is a correct analysis, but I think that this is how the Chinese understand it, and they've placed enormous pressure on South Korea not to adopt a position on the Indo-Pacific, and of course not to participate in things like the Quadrilateral security dialogue. If we pivot down to Taiwan, Taiwan has been relatively open to the idea of the Indo-Pacific, trying to find a place for it in the regional economy and helping shape the region such that it's focused on rules-based order. Places like the Philippines, under President Duterte, looks at the Indo-Pacific concept with open questions. We saw that when he was elected as president of the Philippines, his first trip overseas was to China, and he talked about distancing himself from the United States, and that meant distancing itself from the Indo-Pacific vision as well. And when we look at other Southeast Asian countries, they see the Indo-Pacific strategy articulated by the United States as primarily a containment strategy, a potential strategy that will compel them to choose between their economic livelihood that's seen through China and their security partnership and, frankly, the partnership that goes beyond security, the United States. And they don't want to choose. So when they look at the Indo-Pacific vision or strategy, they're very hesitant. And that hesitancy comes from not wanting to bite the hand that feeds them. That's the Chinese economy. So they've come up with their own Indo-Pacific vision called the ASEAN Indo-Pacific Outlook, which is very, very nuanced, and it talks about ASEAN centrality in any evolution of the region. When we go to Southeast Asia, or South Asia, our Indian friends advocate something called SAGAR, which is basically a free and open and inclusive Indo-Pacific vision. So they're trying to create a space so that China can continue to be part of the Indo-Pacific. But their position has changed quite significantly over the past year as well. And we have other countries, New Zealand and Australia. Australia's on the forefront of talking about the Indo-Pacific. New Zealand is a little bit more hesitant because of its trading relationship with New Zealand. And if we go even further abroad, we talk about the Canadian view about the Indo-Pacific, we're still sitting on the fence. There will be some transition in the coming months, but still I think we're sitting on the fence. And when we move to the EU, our German friends, our Netherlands friends, French and UK friends have taken a stronger position on the Indo-Pacific. And the EU itself has also adopted a strategic vision of the Indo-Pacific. So we see growing interest, and our European friends definitely understand the importance of the region economically and in terms of trying to promote a rules-based region. But like Southeast Asian countries, the EU is thinking about its trade relations with China and how choices about security could potentially affect its relationship with China. So they have a measured approach. And I think, Jakob, if you can share your views, that would be great. And lastly, I think I just want to focus on Afghanistan, because Afghanistan's been on the minds of many of us within the region. And watching what's happened in terms of Afghanistan and in terms of the U.S. Withdrawal. And what does this mean for U.S. credibility? What does it mean for U.S. power within the region? And what does it mean for the U.S.'s commitment to the region? And here I think that Afghanistan is really a poor barometer for the United States' commitment to the broader Indo-Pacific region and its key partners like India, Australia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, and Southeast Asian countries. And I've written about this, but I think when you're going to compare the Afghan relationship with all those other partners that I've mentioned, Afghanistan didn't have the political economic connections with the United States. It didn't have the educational exchanges, scientific exchanges, the deep and decades-long exchanges between businesses, grassroots organizations, people-to-people organizations, politicians, universities. Really, the relationship between the United States and Afghanistan was really about eradicating terrorism and it's a very, very poor comparison for the United States' broader engagement with those core partners that I mentioned. And I think how the United States really is thinking about the Indo-Pacific region. My last comment has to do with Japan. And again, what is Japan's role in the region? And I think that we saw Japan's role under the Trump administration really expand. It expanded because of the unpredictableness of the United States under the Trump administration. And we saw Japan step forward in terms of signing what's called the Comprehensive, Progressive, and Trans-Pacific Partnership, major trading agreement. We also saw Japan step forward and sign the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership and work very, very hard to bring in our Indian friends, which is really Japan trying to embed itself into the political economy of the region. So it's shaping rules and trying to shape the region such that it evolves through institutions and shared norms. We also saw Japan sign the Japan-EU Infrastructure Connectivity Agreement. We saw Japan sign many other agreements to try and strengthen its position and its diplomacy in the region. And Japan was quite promiscuous. As I mentioned, it signed agreements with Japan or China, but it also signed agreements with other countries that and that's really important when we're thinking about Japan's Indo-Pacific approach. It's not what we call a zero-sum. It's about trying to engage with countries that it has a challenged relationship with, but also countries that it shares values and interests with. And when we're looking at Japan and how it's engaging in the Indo-Pacific, it's going to continue to promote what we call rules-based order. Everybody's playing by the same rules. It's going to focus on growingly on international institutions and human rights. It's going to continue to focus on development and connectivity. So basically creating roads and bridges and ports in Southeast Asia and South Asia. And it's going to continue to focus on what we call institution building. And the institution building will be everything from good governance to health infrastructure to rule of law throughout the region. So that's kind of a few key opening points that I wanted to bring up. And I'd love to hear your views or to move forward on a collective discussion. Maya?
Yes, thank you, Stephen. This is fascinating, and what really, well, I found revealing, or I mean, your presentation was revealing to me was that we generally, the people who live here, we generally don't get that image of Japan as being, a major diplomatic player, or in the region. But it seems that this has changed, especially during, the premiership of Mr. Abe. So he has been very active in the field of diplomacy here in this region. So, which is, a great revelation. Hopefully, we'll continue to see Japan as a strong balancing power here in the region as a leader as well, because obviously, we need it. And not only we, I mean the people who live in Japan, but everybody who lives in the region as well, and the European Union and the United States as well. So let's see, everybody who is in the audience, please raise your hand so that we can bring you up on stage. Everybody is welcome to share their opinion. If you have questions to Stephen, Stephen is open to questions as well. So let's see how we can continue the conversation from here, because up until now we had only Stephen talking, and no hands raised yet. Okay, we've got one.
I see Timothy.
Yes, and
I see Jacob from Warsaw. Jacob, do you know how to jump into the dialogue?
I'm just trying to let him up on stage and hear him.
Yes, can I speak now?
Yeah, we can hear you, Jacob. Good to see you. Let me hear from
Okay,
you.
yes, it's good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So, thanks, Stephen, for your excellent speech. And I would like because you presented now your perspective on Indo-Pacific and following our discussion because we have discussed on Indo-Pacific also in a lot of seminars and conference. And what do you think? Which element in Indo-Pacific, in the context of security sphere in infrastructure will be the most important in the next let's say next 2 3 years if whether whether the bilateral agreements of United States with Japan with Australia will be still the most important, or do you see any chance that maybe it will be in future an institution or mini institution, maybe not so big, which will be responsible for security, or still bilateral agreements of United States with the most important allies like Japan, Australia, will be still the crucial in the context of security. No, I don't talk about economic sphere, but security. What do you think?
Thanks, Jacob, and that's great to hear from you. So, uh, I think in this part of the world, and we're thinking about how Japan and the United States and Australia are thinking about this region, I don't think there's a separation between national security and economic security anymore. There's a realization that these are interlinked. And when you think about the next 2 or 3 years in terms of how security policy is going to move forward, what we see is that these core countries understand that their security is very much linked to their economic security. And that means that they're going to have to create resilient supply chains. And what that means is a selective diversification of supply chains in specific areas like some specific technologies such as semiconductors, some technologies such as health and pharmaceuticals, and other supply chains. So they're very concerned about how supply chains can be weaponized or how supply chains can be disrupted because of natural disasters or others. And this can affect country security. And we've seen that over the past 18 months, how many of us had challenges in terms of getting medical care and masks and vaccines delivered to us. And this is because of supply chains. So I think that when we're thinking about the next 2 or 3 years, and we're thinking about how Japan, Australia, United States, and I think other countries, they're going to be concentrated on a couple things. Resilient supply chains and building some alternatives to the China model. That doesn't mean decoupling, and I emphasize that. It doesn't mean decoupling. It means a selective diversification of supply chains. It means they will also invest in health security and help deliver vaccines and help build health infrastructure in Southeast Asia and South Asia, the engines of economic growth, right? If they're not vaccinated and they don't have health infrastructure, we can't we can't create those alternative supply chains and alternative production networks to deliver goods to outside countries. And this is really important. Then lastly is rebuilding the economies in South Asia and Southeast Asia. I can't tell you how important this is. For our Vietnamese friends, our Malaysian friends, the informal economies there have been devastated. People can't go and work. They can't make money. They can't feed their families. For the formal economies where they can get support from the government, that's a different story. So in the short term, I think some of the core countries are going to be thinking about how to speed up development, how to turn on informal and informal economies, how to build health infrastructure. In terms of the kind of the hard security that I think you're interested in, what I see is that we're going to see organizations like the Quad, so that the Australia, India, Japan, and the United States work on very specific areas, but not necessarily all at the same time. So I think in the South China Sea, we're going to see more coordination on maritime and domain awareness activities, so watching what's happening in the region, and more freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. But I think that those four players in the Quad understand the utility of bringing in outside actors. So in a Quad Plus formation, so bringing in Canadians or the Germans or the UK or France on an ad hoc basis to provide some support on particular issues, to send a signal that we can push back a little bit on some of the more assertive claims within the region. And I think that is the direction that security is going to move forward. The core countries will be the core countries of the Quad, but we're going to have a Quad Plus, country added on. Different countries in different scenarios are going to add their capabilities to the Quad to deal with some of the challenges. And this will ultimately depend on how assertive China is in its periphery.
Jacob,
Thank you very much, Stephen.
You're
Thanks.
welcome. Thank you.
thank you. Well, and we have Timothy Langley. Good evening.
Thank you very much. What a great presentation. What a great analysis, Stephen. I really, really enjoyed that. I particularly enjoyed your use of the word promiscuous in describing Japan's foreign policy with the region, and that really hits it on the head. This growing appetite of China for establishing itself in the region, I think, is something that we have to come to terms with, and the growing emergence of many of the naval flotilla of the allied, not allied, the friends of Japan, friends of the United States, the aircraft carrier from England arriving in port. The two kind of tools that it seems to me that will be more and more greatly enhanced are the defense component, which is the stick, and the economic benefit of, not screwing things up, maintaining status quo. China would suffer as greatly as everyone else if there was an outbreak of the tensions in the region. So it's really a delicate time that we're in right now. I think as far as the Japanese are concerned, policy-wise, yeah, what's happened in Afghanistan, I think, is just one of those things that people critical of the United States and critical of the United States policeman's role can point to and say, well, see, that's why we don't want to be that close with those guys. As long as we maintain the tit for tat and we keep an eye on the tit and the tat and it's balanced, let's not get sucked into something where we're throwing our weight behind the United States and they're calling all the shots, and then we're left holding the bag at the end of the day. That signal is really damaging to America's ability to project its influence in this region. But this is a discussion, I think, it bears having as often as we can manage. I understand this room will be twice a month. But I'm eagerly looking forward to it, and what a great collection in the audience, too.
Thanks so much, Timothy.
I wonder, we have elections coming up in Japan, and as Stephen said, Japan actually became the balancing power here in the region during the premiership of Mr. Abe. And now, of course, we had Mr. Suga, who was obviously not as, let's say, fluent in international relations as Mr. Abe was. So, and I wonder how the leadership of the LDP actually thinks, or what they think about the role which Japan is expected to play in the region. I'm sure that they realize it's important, but of course we need a leader here in Japan who can really play that role and project the image of power and stability as well.
So I think, Maya, if we are watching what's happening over the past, let's say 2 months, Japan has been out there talking about a lot of things, but I think one of the core areas that we should be thinking about is Taiwan. And what we've seen is Vice Premier Aso say very explicitly that Japan would have to come to defend Taiwan if there was some kind of problem in the Taiwan Straits. The Defense Minister Kishi also said something similar. And we've seen Taiwan come up in the joint communique at the G7 back in June. We saw Taiwan come up in the bilateral summit between Prime Minister Suga and President Biden back in April. And we've seen Taiwan come up in many documents over the past 6 months. So Japan has been very explicit about its concerns about what's happening across straits. But if you take a more granular look at their position, they're advocating for the status quo and not a change either from the Taiwanese side or the Chinese side. And I think that's really important for Japan, how it views the whole region. It understands how integrated the economies are in the Indo-Pacific, and that a disruption, whether it's in the Taiwan Straits or the East China Sea or the South China Sea, can dramatically affect many economies. And that it's in Japan's interest to continue to send the strongest of signals. And you probably saw just last week, the LDP and their Taiwanese equivalents had a discussion about defense. It wasn't a country-to-country discussion. It was a party-to-party discussion. And this is, again, signaling to China that, we're not going to change the one China policy. We want to have constructive relations based on transparent and rules-based behavior. And we want you to maintain the status quo. And I think that within the LDP, they understand that. I think that there's a real sense that it's really important to not create a confrontation with China and not to push Secretary General Xi Jinping into a corner where he has to take a very nationalistic stance on an issue like the Senkaku Islands or Taiwan or something in the South China Sea. And their position is cautious. It's not. I don't think it is an adventurous position at this time.
Can I just jump in right there, Stephen? I
Yeah.
think, the Japanese have not been known for providing leadership, but they really are good at generating consensus and rulemaking. And I think, as you opened your comments, that's really where they're placing their bets, to generate that consensus, to be friendly with people, to try and generate a united front, because I don't think anybody depends on the Japanese to provide leadership on the issue. I think they're stronger when they're a component of something that's more unified. I think you nailed that one right on the head.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, of course, Japan's positions are somewhat subject to the United States positions. But Japan is, its neighbors with North Korea and China, arguably the biggest security challenges for Japan. And its position is very different than the United States. So it takes a more cautious, nuanced approach that depends on the strong alliance with the United States. But as you've seen over the past years, Japan is also building other security partnerships. We saw Prime Minister Scott Morrison visit Tokyo last October for one day to sign an agreement to commit to a defense treaty with Japan. And Scott Morrison flew home to a 2-week quarantine just to do that. And we've seen Japan build other security partnerships with the UK, France, Canada. They're not alliances. They're security and strategic partnerships, but they're meant to create a really broad and comprehensive security framework for Japan to rely on to deal with some of its challenges. And that's a nuanced approach. It's not necessarily an adventurous or an aggressive approach.
Thank you for that explanation. It sounds reassuring. Yes, Jacob?
And Stephen, if I may,
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
So following your explanation, and you told about the Quad, and if I may have question, what is the perception of Japan on Quad? What kind of what should be a Quad? It should be more political institution. The Quad should develop Quad plus cooperation, as you said, with different partners, or should be a formal alliance. So, what is the Japanese approach to Quad? And if you could present Japanese perception of what is the perception of foreign minister authorities, but also how Japanese scholars think about Quad. What is the perception? Or the next question, is it the Quad is a hot topic among Japanese scholars, or only the scholars who focus on Asia Pacific really interested in this? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jacob. So, for the Quad is what's called the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, and I think that for many of us, I'm going to talk about this from, I guess, a layperson standpoint, just to give you a background. So, after the tsunami back in 2005 in the Indian Ocean, India and Japan, Australia, and the United States came together to provide some search and rescue and humanitarian assistance, disaster relief to Indonesia and the region. And this was kind of the initial incarnation of the so-called Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. And from there, there was some momentum to try to institutionalize the Quad. And what we saw is there was a breakdown in the India-Australian relations. The Australians didn't want to upset China because at that time they had strong economic relations, and the Indians and Australians were not on the same book in terms of security cooperation, and we saw the Quad disappear. But under Prime Minister Abe, the Quad came back, and what we saw in 2017 is a ministerial meeting, and they started to talk about areas of cooperation. But really, I think the Quad is taken on, it's quite dynamic in terms of the directions it's going. After the virtual Quad summit in March in Washington, between the leaders, what was agreed on was really, really interesting. They talked about, of course, rule of law. They talked about maritime security, but they really talked about enhancing supply chains, resilient supply chains, and they talked about boosting vaccine development and distribution to emerging countries in India. That was something that sold in all the capitals, right? Whether it's New Delhi, Tokyo, Canberra, or Washington, that was something that they thought was really, really important. So supply chain resilience and dealing with vaccine diplomacy. And that's a big transition, I think, from the security cooperation that sometimes goes on between the Quad partners. So on the one hand, I think the security side has been downplayed, but we're still seeing security cooperation, Jacob. So back in January 2021, we had a Quad Plus cooperation between Canada and the four partners. In April, we had the Quad partners join a French exercise. So the French didn't join the Quad members. It was the Quad members who joined the French. And we're seeing more of this kind of maritime domain awareness and joint cooperation between Quad partners and other partners to provide some collective power in the maritime domain. But this has not been institutionalized. I think that this broader signal is that it will only move in the direction that China pushes it. So if China is more aggressive and more assertive in the maritime domain, we should expect the Quad to become a tighter security cooperation. At the same time, the Quad's going to start to be more proactive in, again, that supply chain area that I mentioned, diversification of supply chains, being a mechanism or a minilateral that is providing public goods to the region. And I think that's going to be actually a bigger role for the Quad moving forward, and it will be much more attractive for Southeast Asian countries, if the Quad is providing a public good rather than just seen as a security partner. So that leads to the question, what is Japan thinking about? I think they're happy for it to remain a foursome. I think they're happy for it to have an ambiguous framework that they work with that allows it to do many things. And I think that they're uncomfortable with institutionalizing it into a formal alliance, because an alliance means it's an alliance against something. But as it stands now, it's not an alliance. It's a grouping of countries that provides public good to the Indo-Pacific region.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, let me invite also Rick. Hello, Rick.
Hello. So thank you very much for letting me in this speaker section. And Stephen, thank you very much. Stephen, thank you very much for giving us a profound insight on the Indo-Pacific security concept. I want to ask you about like South Korea, because the security of South Korea or the security of Korea Peninsula is very related with like the safety of Japan. And what I want to ask you is, like, few days ago or few weeks ago, I read an article about like Korean people, Korean experts on the so-called right wing, getting so shocked about the Afghan incident, because they consider the next is us, next is Korea Peninsula. And what I want to ask you is whether there's a possibility for withdrawal of American army from Korean Peninsula, and how people or how experts in North American continent see about the possibility of withdrawal of this American army if the next president of South Korea becomes kind of person on the side of left wing. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Rick. Those are some great questions. So I think that when we can never say there's zero chance for anything, right?
Right.
So I think that, and there was real concerns under the former president about the potential, if he had two terms, what would that mean for the alliance structures within the region? But I think that we should also be conscious of why the United States is on the Korean Peninsula. It is to protect South Korea, and that is a legal alliance, right? They would have to, I think it's 2 or 3 years they have to give before they would be able to withdraw their troops from South Korea. So that there's a legal aspect to thinking about the timing. But I think that the Americans' position in South Korea now is somewhat cemented, because now our North Korean neighbor has weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. It has the ability to project that in short, mid, and long range through ICBM missiles and can potentially hit the United States. And the United States security, its national interests, are best served being in the peninsula to stop those missiles before they launch. So my sense is that the United States is very much embedded in South Korea because of its national interests. Second, I think that we should also look at the interests of South Korea in terms of how it thinks about North Korea. The best way to deal with North Korea is to is from a position of strength and deterrence, and that South Korea can't do that alone. It doesn't have the same commitment to a militarized state as North Korea. So it requires, I think, the United States to be there. Now, that leads to the question, what happens if we have a progressive leader that is the next president of the United States? And will that affect bilateral relations? Potentially. I don't know if any of us thought that President Moon would be as progressive and prioritize North-South relations over the alliance as much as he seems to be doing. I think that the current administration in the Blue House has created quite a challenge for bilateral relations between Japan and South Korea, but also for trilateral cooperations between Japan, South Korea, and the United States, specifically because of Moon's politics. But Moon's politics is not universally popular in South Korea. If you talk to the Ministry of Defense or you talk to people associated with the conservatives, they're not very happy with what's happened under the Moon administration. They may not be the closest of relations with Japan, but they have a much more pragmatic approach with Japan. So I think that moving forward after March 2022, that we'll have a better sense of the direction of South Korea. If you look at the recent surveys, I think that the fact that China has surpassed Japan as the most unpopular country in South Korea really says a lot about the politics in South Korea. And I think that we're likely to see a conservative politician come in. And that conservative politician will probably be more supportive of the Quad initiative as well as the Indo-Pacific initiative. And I think they'll demand a quid pro quo from the Biden administration in terms of more deterrence capabilities from North Korea for support on the Quad and the Indo-Pacific. I hope that helps, Rick.
Thank you very much for answering my fuzzy question. Thank you.
Great question. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. And also, Ankita, hello. Your mic is muted now. Okay.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Am I audible? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi. Thank you all for inviting me to this. It's been a great learning experience. It's 8 a.m. here in the US. So my question is that Japan is a member of Quad, and so is India. But unlike Japan, India shares a 2,000-mile-long border with China, and there's a lot of power asymmetry, as I see in the region, with China being more assertive. Japan, on the other hand, has a very nuanced approach, like Stephen mentioned, to its foreign commitments and security arrangements. So can Japan going forward be expected to play a defining role in China-India conflict in order to solidify its commitment to the rules-based order? Or would Japan continue to have the same nuanced approach going forward?
Thank you very much, Ankita. I think that's a really interesting question. So we have a tension between Japan and India. We see Japan, wanting to, they demand India, or they don't demand, but they ask India if they'll support Japan's positions on North Korea and trying to encourage North Korea to denuclearize and to help Japan on some of its claims in the East China Sea. And our Indian friends say no. And the reverse is true as well. Our Indian friends say, Japan, can you help us with Pakistan? Can you help us denuclearize Pakistan? And what our Japanese friends say is, well, it's, we don't want to really support this. Pakistan's an important partner for us. They're trying to actively court Pakistan so that it can have, weaken China's influence in Pakistan. So we have a problem that both sides are not willing to support each other's initiatives. Now, as you mentioned, India has a 2,000-kilometer border with China. It's a very complex relationship. The power asymmetry is huge, and it's only increasing, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. And that is going to create a challenge. And we see in the past when there's a power asymmetry between China and a neighbor, usually they take advantage of it. So can India depend on Japan to deal with this? I don't think so. I don't think so from a legal standpoint. The Japanese constitution doesn't allow Japan to dispatch troops for the purpose of conflict. But I also think that the norms in Japan, even amongst the most hawkish people, really aren't out there thinking about defending other countries in their backyard. Of course, defending Japan in Japan's backyard, there's a lot of support. But sending troops to India, I'm just not so sure about that. Japan's preference for aid is to help build internal capabilities. And there's a couple ways that it's doing it. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So one way that Japan has tried to enhance India's capability is to build some roads and bridges in northern India so that Indians are able to transport goods and the military tools to the border where the most contested features are between China and India. Another way for Japan to contribute to India's own strategic autonomy and its ability to push back against assertive behavior by neighbors is to strengthen its economy. So India has been since 2003, I believe, the biggest recipient of Japanese FDI globally. So Japan is really trying to invest in India to self-strengthen India. And we see that Japan does something similar in Southeast Asia, where it's heavily investing in what we call overseas development aid, or in Japanese we say okane dake ageru, only give money. And we see a huge investment of FDI, as well as trying to support institution building. And Japan's viewpoint is that if they can create more intra-regional integration, that this will self-strengthen the region, and self-strengthen the region will create more strategic autonomy, allowing Southeast Asian countries to make different decisions when it comes to China. So that's my kind of answer in a nutshell. I don't think it focuses so much on security per se, but more about the economic tools that Japan can bring to help self-strengthen India.
Thank you. Thank you for the response.
My pleasure. I see Hiroshi in the room.
Yes, we've got Hiroshi. Hello, Hiroshi.
I got the same hat, Hiroshi. I love it.
Hi, good evening, Stephen and Maya and everybody. And thank you for lifting me up here in this room. And I'm very interested in about the Indo-Pacific concept, which is done by the Stephen. And I'm very interested in the Afghanistan situation right now. As you see, the U.S. has withdrawn its forces from Afghanistan on the end of August due to a lot of the circumstances, like rising up the Taliban or the forces in Afghanistan. And what I'm thinking is that who will be the main player or the factor of this region. As you see, the Afghanistan is facing with the 6 countries like China, Iran, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. So my information is based on the publicized information like American intelligence or whatever. And as far as I know, embassy, Chinese embassy, Russian embassy, or the embassy staff of China or the Russia has been staying there. They're not evacuating. They're still there because they have the bilateral the ties with the Taliban, China, and Russia too. So according to the national statistics or whatever, China has already purchased the right of the mining, the copper mining in Afghanistan in 2015, I think. And there must be a huge amount of the copper mining in there. But I'm not for sure the China is not only for focusing on the copper mining. They're trying to secure the initiative of that area, and also the Pakistan. As far as I know, there are a lot of the international terrorist groups in there. Lashkar-e-Jhangvi or Lashkar-e-Taiba, or the Al-Qaeda and Islamic States and Haqqani groups or whatever. And those are all the affected by Pakistan. So I'm not for sure who will be the heavy initiative in this area. And I've heard that the United Nations National Security Council will be held on 14th of September. So in that the meeting or the council, there must be some discussion. How do they handle or cope with the chaotic situation in Afghanistan? So I would like to ask you the who will be or the main player of this Afghanistan issue, and what about the commitment of China and Russia and India or Pakistan? Thank you.
Thanks, Hiroshi. Some really important questions. So I think when I look at Afghanistan, I'm looking at it through the lens of the Taliban and ISIS-K and extremism. And then as I connect those three ideas, I'm thinking about what that means for India and what that means for China. On the China front, I think that when they look at those three areas, they're very concerned. They're concerned about what is the potential for the Taliban or ISIS-K and extremism to inspire separatism in Xinjiang, the western part of China. Is there a possibility for that? And this is why the Chinese have taken such a hard stance against the Uyghur people, putting them in re-education camps and fundamentally transforming the western part of China as
Agree.
to fight the three evils of separatism, extremism, and terrorism. So I think the Chinese are very, very concerned about this, and you hear this and you read this in the writing, where Wang Yi, the foreign minister, basically said that we have a responsibility to help we means everyone, responsibility for the Taliban to govern correctly. They're very concerned about this. They're also concerned about the terrorism and extremism being exported into Pakistan and eventually to India. First, the Pakistan part. Pakistan is the best friend of China. It's the home of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPAC. And this is the signature project of China in terms of the BRI. Their view is if it can't, it must work in China. It must work in Pakistan. And if it doesn't work in Pakistan, it's not going to work anywhere, right? Because they're best of friends. And I think they're concerned that the export of terrorism or extremism into Pakistan could disrupt the signature CPAC or Belt Road initiatives in Pakistan. And they're already having problems in northern Pakistan, in Balochistan, with attacks on BRI projects. So this could be a real problem for China if, the place that they've invested so much money, billions and billions of dollars, all of a sudden stops being a place where they can invest money. And this will have geopolitical consequences in terms of how China's trying to build access to the port of Hormuz through Pakistan. So I think that's a big concern. And I mentioned India. India is very concerned. They've been primarily the victims of terrorism and extremism through Pakistan. And they're worried about what does this mean. And I think that nobody wants a regional conflict within the region, but if extremism does increase and the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan becomes an inspiring example for other extremist organizations, this could create a lot more regional tensions and regional extremism and regional terrorism that is not good for any of the countries. So with that, I think that China will try to buy their way into Afghanistan, and they will try to provide the incentive such that the Taliban don't export intentionally or unintentionally terrorism or extremism into any other parts of the region. Whether it can do that successfully or not, I'm just not sure. I don't think so. You mentioned Russia. Unlike China, Russia has learned their lessons with regards to terrorism, and they've dealt with terrorism directly on all their borders, and they've crushed it ruthlessly. And they're not going to put too many resources into the region. Rather, they're going to spend resources in trying to ensure that the terrorism doesn't come back into the borders of Russia. Remember, parts of the Southern Caucasus are they're part of the Russian state, but they believe that they're striving for autonomy and more independence. And from the Russian point of view, they're concerned that the Taliban again might inspire these groups to return to terrorism. And this is not good. But I don't think the Russians have the resources or the naivety to go back in Afghanistan and spend the resources, where I think the Chinese don't have the experience, and they think they may be able to buy their way into some kind of settlement.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
And
Hiroshi.
may I follow you, and may I follow Maya?
Please follow everybody.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Hiroshi.
Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Yes. Mark?
Oh, hey, Stephen. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thanks. So thanks for setting up the room. So this is my first time. So my question is, I've been following Afghanistan for a while, and like you said before, the withdrawal is what we're keeping an eye on. But there's also the talk about maybe some of the countries like U.S., Canada, Europe. They like the wait and see approach. I know Japan's doing the same thing, but do you think that they will actually provide economic aid, but they will not recognize the Taliban government in Kabul? But that's because they have the problem in Panjshir, and the last time I heard, Panjshir is already occupied. So I just want to see your thoughts on it.
So my sense is that everybody is taking a wait and see approach to Afghanistan and how the Taliban, once they consolidate their governance, will move forward. I think for Japan and Canada and South Korea that have all been involved in terms of developmental activities, ultimately they can't do those activities unless they have security support from the United States. So that means it's a very problematic situation. I think the general direction doesn't look very good at this stage, and I don't know if you followed the news, but there was a doctor, Nakamura Sensei, who was spent a lot of time in Afghanistan trying to help alleviate poverty, and there were some murals in Afghanistan, kind of honoring him because he was murdered there, and the Taliban have ordered that to be removed. So that's not a good sign, right? It's not a good sign that the Taliban are going to be open to development projects and people that have died to try and help Afghanistan people. Perhaps the Western developmental agencies won't be the primary vehicles of help. It might have to be the Red Crescent and other Islamic-oriented or related organizations that will have to be the important groups that provide some kind of aid. But I think that we're all just waiting to find out what's happening, what kind of Taliban will this be? Will they be a more moderate one? Will they allow women to go to school and be part of the government? Or will they return to the pre-9/11 Taliban? And I think that is, nobody knows at this particular stage.
All right. Good to hear. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Bruce? Bruce is in the room.
Bruce?
Oh, there you go. Okay. Yeah. It was a really short question. John Kerry was in China recently, and basically kind of the envoy for climate change.
Yep.
Apparently just got shot down, or like what in the whole discussions, there's nothing hearing too much about climate change, which is seemingly kind of very pretty critical issue that the everybody needs to get together. I just wonder what your thoughts were in terms of how all the players within the region are going to work together to on climate change.
Thanks, Bruce. I think climate change is, it is an existential issue. And, I'm based in Japan and I'm from Canada, and we don't see climate change so much, although we've had, of course, floods and heavy rainstorms have knocked down villages, but we haven't seen anything like we've seen in other countries. But for the Pacific Island countries, Southeast Asian countries, South Asia, climate change is going to be transformative. If sea levels go up even, let's say, 20 centimeters, we don't know what will happen to the Mekong Delta, right? It'll be salinized. And what does that mean for the breadbasket or the rice basket for Southeast Asia? What does it mean for Bangladesh and the lower lying areas of India in terms of their food production, and how will this affect social stability and economies? These are really, really serious issues, right? And
Just to kind of put a finer point on it, China is the gorilla in the room. What is China? Where do you see China putting its now to address this? So sorry, that's something I should have said.
So yes, China is one of the most heavy polluters. I know that they're seen as a producer of many green technologies, solar panels, etc. But I think as where's Han? Han is in the call. She's doing a bit of research on this. But to create those solar panels, it's really dirty, right? You have to use a lot of heavy metals and rare earths, and this is not an easy process to produce these issues. So yeah, China is a huge polluter, but it's not just China. We have Indonesia, we have India. These huge countries, because they're huge, they produce a lot of pollution. What are they doing about it? I think domestically, if you've been in and out of China like I have over the past 10 years, there's a huge improvement in the domestic environment. But they still have, air issues and soil pollution and water pollution. I think that China at this stage is basically said to the United States that we're not going to move forward on climate change cooperation unless there's an overall improvement in the relationships, bilateral relationship. So the question is, what will the Biden administration or the next administration do to shove the relationship in a better direction? I think that there's been some signals by the United States. So, for example, they've renewed student visas for Chinese students coming to study in the United States. They may take some other actions that allow the Chinese to save face and then come back to the negotiating table on climate change. But we don't have the political space between the two countries at this stage to fundamentally come to an agreement. So that leads to the question is, what will other countries do? And what we see is countries already individually taking a position on, for example, carbon freezing and carbon levels. So Japan and South Korea and China have all made commitments to carbon, where countries like Australia haven't. That seems to be the position moving forward, is the countries that can will, and the countries that can't will try to get aid from more technologically advanced countries. I think there's also a clear commitment by many more developed countries, including those in the EU and Japan and South Korea, to provide more environmentally friendly technologies and economic frameworks for developing countries to kind of develop in a more green fashion. But I don't have an optimistic or a magic answer to your question, Mark. Bruce.
Thanks for that.
You're welcome.
Unfortunately, but thanks.
I think Bill's in the
Bill's
room.
in the room. Just before we proceed, I'm going to turn the hand permissions off because we're just about 10 minutes before 9:30. And Stephen, I sense that you're kind of tired already. So
Yeah, 9:30. I'm a Cinderella boy.
Right.
Sorry, sorry
Yes, you're going to
everyone.
turn into a pumpkin, I know. Okay. So, and Bill, welcome on stage. Can you hear us? Yes,
Hello.
okay.
Yes. Can you hear my voice
Yes.
clearly?
Yeah, we sure can.
Thank you. Hello, Stephen and Maya. Warm greetings from Indonesia and
Oh,
very
Great.
great.
interesting
Yes.
room. I do a lot of, well, I observe a lot of things that hope happens in the Asia Pacific region. So I'm glad to be here and to be able to ask you some questions. Um, you brought up a very interesting point on moving towards sustainability for Japan, and Japan has already made commitments to become net zero by 2050. Correct me if I'm wrong, and that
Yep.
can fact check me. But it is going to take a toll on the amount of capital that's going to be necessary in order to move towards that net zero goal by 2050. And there's a lot of factors to come in: the airline industry, train, railway, and especially the commercial car industry. Um, how do you see that going, and how do you think Japan, as a large producer of commercial auto vehicles, would be able to actually perhaps um, pave the way for a more energy conscious, climate conscious Asia Pacific, with the role of a lot of these automobile giants producing perhaps electrical vehicle or some way half and half in order to actually get them as a nation to get to that net zero goal, and also in effect bring climate consciousness towards the rest of the Asia Pacific region. We know that China has been leading the way for some time, with a competitor to Tesla cited as the Tesla killer. I forgot the name of the company, but it's very, very successful so far and very fast paced in their production and manufacturing pace. How do you see that? Thank you.
Thanks so much. I have to say I'm not an environmental expert. If I was to recommend you to read some work, I'd recommend you to read like Jay Nakano's work at CSIS or Ken Koyama. These people really think about technologies. But what we've seen, I think, in terms of Japan's leadership and how Japan is thinking about changing its economy is that they're going to phase out fossil fuel cars by 2030, as you mentioned, trying to come to a carbon zero footprint by 2050. I think that there is growing, pessimism or realization that there's going to be a nuclear pillar to Japan's road towards zero carbon. And I think that the industries are really committed to developing vehicles that are, electrical vehicles. The question, I think, goes back to my point about China, when they're building solar panels. It's a very dirty process. So not only do they have to build the electrical vehicles, but they have to find a way to create it be a clean process to make those vehicles. And I think that is going to be a challenge. I don't know the technical spheres, and as I said, Jay Nakano at CSIS or Ken Koyama, much more articulate about these particular areas. But I think that is kind of the direction that we're going to go. Japan has some advantages, if you want to call them advantages. By 2050, it'll probably be about 20 million people smaller. So its environmental burden will be less. It's already has very, very well developed train systems and infrastructure. So it doesn't have to invest in those in the same way that emerging countries have to. So I think that the equation for us to think about this is, how can more advanced economies like Japan help emerging countries develop their economy so that they are, more friendly. So that means exporting technologies about infrastructure, exporting train systems, exporting all those things that make Japan such an efficient and easy place to get around, and find a way to do that cheaply, but maintain and increase the environmental standards. I think that's generally how Japan is moving. The question is how do they finance that and capitalize it, and how do emerging countries afford it? And I think that that is a question that people at JICA and JBIC, the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, and others are trying to find creative solutions to chart a way forward that is more environmentally friendly.
Thank you. And one quick one. Do you think the Fifth Amendment on rare earth metals industries is a move in consideration of that goal?
I'll be honest, I don't know what the Fifth Amendment is. Can you...
No, the FEFTA, the Foreign Exchange and Foreign Trade Act that limits the ownership of foreign investors in Japanese critical core industries relating to rare earth metals.
I think that's a direction that many countries are going, Bill. And that ultimately is targeted at one country, China. But I think that that is probably the direction that many countries are going. And that goes back to, I think, my point I mentioned to Jacob earlier about the increasing difficulty of separating national security and economic security. And countries like Japan have been really on the front line of that. And if you go back to 2010, Japan faced rare earth embargoes from China after it arrested a fisherman that rammed Japanese Coast Guard vessels. And Japan's reaction was to go out and find alternative rare earth materials so that they could not be coerced by China. And I think that is probably the direction that many countries are going to go, is they're going to find a way to securitize certain things like rare earth materials so that they can protect their economies. And I think that they're going to create a trusted group of countries and like-minded partners that they can expand these partnerships with moving forward. And you've already seen kind of the groundwork on this in terms of the Quad talking about resilient supply chains. And you do see increasingly amount of talk about how different countries, like-minded countries, can share these critical resources to be that kind of reliable, trusted partner.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, my wonderful room. Hope to hear more from you guys and from this club. Thank you.
This was Japan Expert Insights Room on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air in 2 weeks on Monday at 8:30 p.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the conversations on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, and Facebook too. Again, we're looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and enjoy every day as much as possible. See you!